finally be able to build the kingdom of heaven. When a period of history repeats the events of a previous period, albeit with differences in scope and degree, the two periods are called parallel providential periods. Parallel providential periods recur because of repeated dispensations to restore the foundation for the Messiah. Accordingly, the factors which determine the formation of parallel providential periods are: 1. First, the three conditions necessary for the foundation of faith: central figure, the condition, and the numerical period of indemnity. 2. Second, the indemnity condition to remove the fallen nature, which is necessary to restore the foundation of substance. According to the principle of predestination, since God absolutely predestines his will, he surely will realize it one day. However, whether God's will is fulfilled through any particular individual is conditional upon the fulfillment of his portion of responsibility, which is in addition to God's portion of responsibility. Accordingly, when the will is not fulfilled because the responsible person fails, God will choose another person in a different era to take his place. God will continue his work until its complete fulfillment, prolonging the providence in the process. According to the principle of creation, when the providence of restoration is prolonged, it may extend to as many as 3 stages. In order to examine the characteristics of a providential period, we need to identify the people centrally responsible for God's providence in that period and the source material for their history. The history of Israel, which was centrally responsible for God's providence in the age of the providence of restoration, provides the source material with which to study the providential history in that age. The history of Christianity was centrally responsible for the providence in the age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration, provides the source material for understanding the providential history in this age. The age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration has been to restore through substantial parallels the age of the providence of restoration, the age of image parallels. As the periods of this age were to restore through indemnity the corresponding periods of the previous age, these periods proceeded in a parallel fashion both in order and in length. The 400-year period of persecution in the Roman Empire, in the age of the prolongation of the providence of restoration, was to restore the Israelites' 400-year period of slavery in Egypt. Likewise, the 400-year period of the regional church leadership was to restore the 400-year period of the judges. And the 120-year period of the Christian Empire was to restore the 120-year period of the United Kingdom. The 400-year period of the divided kingdoms of East and West was to restore the 400-year period of the divided kingdoms of North and South. The 210-year period of papal exile and return was to restore the 210-year period of Israel's exile to Babylon and return. Another 400-year period of preparation for the advent of the Messiah elapsed before Jesus came. Likewise, Christianity is to meet Christ at the second advent only after passing through 400 years of preparation for the second advent of the Messiah. In seeking for an ideal society on heaven's side, people's original mind has drawn them to the ideals of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. The world in which these ideals will finally be realized is none other than the kingdom of heaven on earth, under the leadership of the returning Christ. Since Satan mimics God's providence in advance, the satanic side has advocated scientific socialism based on dialectical and historical materialism and built the communist world. For the paths of religion, politics, and economy to converge and realize God's ideal, a new expression of truth must emerge which can completely integrate religion and science. The religion founded upon this truth will lead all of humanity to become one with God in heart. Such people will build an economy in accordance with the divine ideal, providing the foundations for a new political order to realize the ideal of creation. This will be the Messianic kingdom, built on the principles of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. This 130-year period began in 1517, when Martin Luther raised the banner of the Protestant Reformation, and lasted until the religious wars were settled by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. In the late Middle Ages, the man's original mind was repressed, its free development blocked by the social environment of feudalism and the corruption of the Roman Church. Thus, medieval Europeans sought to break down their social environment to open the way for the restoration of their original nature. The Cain-type movement began as a revival of Hellenism and gave rise to the Renaissance, whose core value was humanism. The Abel-type movement began as a revival of the Hebraic heritage of Israel and gave rise to the Protestant Reformation, whose core value was faith in God. This 140-year period began with the secure establishment of Protestantism at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 and ended with the French Revolution in 1789. After the Renaissance and the Reformation, modern people could not avoid divisions in theology and disputes among philosophies arising from freedom of faith and thought. God's providence of restoration separates those representing Abel from those representing Cain, and in the last days this fallen world is divided into the Cain-type and Abel-type worlds. The Cain-type world is to submit to the Abel-type world to establish the worldwide foundation of substance. This is necessary before we can receive Christ at the second advent and realize the unified world. For this to happen, two views of life which would later mature into these two worlds had to be established. The Cain-type and Abel-type views of life developed in this period. This period refers to the 130 years between the French Revolution in 1789 and the end of the First World War in 1918. Cain-type and Abel-type views of life matured, taking their separate paths, and founded a Cain-type society and an Abel-type society, respectively. The Cain-type view of life gave rise to the French Revolution and thus Cain-type democracy, which eventually formed the communist world. The Abel-type view of life led to the Puritan Revolution and thus Abel-type democracy, which developed into the democratic world of today. We cannot grasp the providential significance of the world wars by focusing only on their external causes, conflicts in politics, economy, and ideology. What are the internal providential causes of the world wars from the viewpoint of God's providence of restoration? The internal providential causes of the world wars. The world wars have occurred, first, as a result of Satan's last desperate struggle to preserve his sovereignty. Second, in order to fulfill the worldwide indemnity conditions to restore the three great blessings defectively realized by Satan in advance. Third, in order that all humanity may overcome on the world level Jesus' three temptations. Fourth, in order to fulfill the worldwide indemnity condition to restore God's sovereignty. The victory of God's side, countries taking the same direction as God, in the First World War, laid the foundation for the birth of the returning Christ, and the formation stage of the dispensation of the Second Advent commenced. Through the victory of God's side in the Second World War, the age for building a new heaven and a new earth under the leadership of Christ at the Second Advent had begun, and the growth stage of the dispensation of the Second Advent commenced. At the consummation of human history, Satan's side and God's side will strive until they each attain sovereignty over a world. This is why the democratic world and the communist world stand confronting each other. Consequently, it became inevitable that there be world wars, first to divide and then to unify these two worlds. The First and Second World Wars had the providential purpose to divide the globe into these two worlds. Afterwards, the Third World War must take place to unify them. However, there are two possible ways it may be fought: through armed conflicts or as a wholly internal ideological conflict. By which way the war will be fought depends upon success or failure in carrying out the human portion of responsibility. By winning victory in the three world wars, which belong to the final chapter of providential history, God's side will fully restore through indemnity all the aspects of the providence of restoration and realize God's ideal world. Jesus clearly foretold of his return. Yet, he added,